Well, didn't Imola look wonderful today in the late autumn Italian weather? As Max Verstappen said, there was always going to be a slight question mark about how 2020 Formula One cars looked on a classic circuit like Imola. And for recent reference, you've got to look at Goodwood, where they ran some reasonably current, well, relatively modern Formula One cars recently, and they looked completely out of place. The circuit looked too small, the cars were going around on rails, it was very unimpressive. But the 2020 Mercs and Red Bulls and Alpha Tauris all look fabulous going around Imola. And all the drivers are saying, wow, what a circuit. Why don't we have tracks like this anymore on the calendar? Well, the answer is, of course, that we went to the modern Hermann Tilke type super circuit because having Hermann Tilke designing and building the tracks was part of the complete Formula One package that was either to be sold on in the future or to be managed in situ. And if, so long as Formula One had control over the way the circuits looked and developed, they had control over the camera angles and the amount of television time that could be given to sponsors that would come in, mainly with the circuits, but sometimes with the teams. The circuit sponsorship controlled, of course, by the Formula One economy. So all of the things that, say, a Lewis Hamilton is talking about when he says, why don't we have tracks like this anymore? Well, the answer is that we went away from tracks like Imola because they're a bit too quick and the cars don't point enough in the direction you need them. You can't manipulate them enough to give the sponsors on the cars or in the background the sort of exposure that Formula One wanted. Let's hope the future's slightly more broad brushed. And that's the answer. And Imola is a shining example of a sort of racetrack that was built around the geography of the land, and it works. It works beautifully. It just smells, eats, sleeps, drinks motor racing, Italian style. Looking at the overhead shots and looking at the paddock area and how relatively compact, tightly fitted all the garages and the trucks are and the motorhomes out the back, it reminds me of why Imola left the calendar in the first place. Yes, of course, there were safety considerations, and it is true. Ayrton Senna did say to Bernie Ecclestone before the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, we should put in a chicane, and was told that he could do it so long as he paid for it. But the real answer, of course, is the river there. And I remember saying to Bernie several times, why are we leaving Imola? It's such a great place. And he said, well, there's no room in the paddock. You know, everybody wants a bigger paddock area. If they want the paddock area, they want all their motorhomes, they can move the river. And that was it. And so everybody left Imola, mainly for motorhome reasons, would you believe? I mean, when you come down to it, Imola is a fairly basic circuit. There are really 7 corners. If you count each chicane as one corner and Tosa as a corner and the left-hander at the top of the hill, as we always called it, a corner. But it's a great circuit in the sense that it's very quick, and all the approaches to those corners, generally speaking, require very, very precise high-speed braking, and then the creation of a platform that allows you to manipulate the car while still being in a position mid-corner to judge the exit perfectly. I think when assessing qualifying, and we'll get onto it in precise detail in a minute, but I think when assessing qualifying, I think it's very important to remember what Juan Manuel Fangio once said, which is that if you've done the corner correctly, in other words, all the preparation is right and the platform is perfect and you've come out of the brakes at the right rate, you've got the steering in perfectly, by mid-corner, the rest of it should be very easy. You should be able to put, as he said at the time, a cent coin on the edge of the track, exactly where you want to hit it. And just to drive the car to that little coin and hit it perfectly isn't that difficult if you're an athlete with tremendous precision, judgment, reflexes, balance, which all the drivers have. So actually driving from apex to exit is the easy bit, providing, of course, you've got the car perfectly positioned at the apex from very high speed. And of course, that is the epitome of the art. Now getting down to fine details, I think what we're seeing at Imola, particularly at the last corner section, which is a double apex left, but the second part of that, obviously the second left, is a critical corner because it leads on to the long straight right down to what they call turn 1, the first chicane. So an exit from there is absolutely, a clear exit from there is absolutely vital. And we saw many drivers running wide, spraying gravel all over the place. And that should be a point to be borne in mind when we think about the race tomorrow and the potential for overtaking. Yeah, it's going to be difficult once they start to go up the hill and then in the whole hill section. But drivers will put wheels on the gravel, they'll go over the curb, all sorts of things will happen. So in a sense that clean overtaking maneuvers may not be very rife on Sunday, what we will see are quite a lot of mistakes, which will induce an overtaking maneuver. That's my prediction anyway. Anyway, getting back to the point, I think what is great about Imola is that any driver who goes for it through that last double apex left section and doesn't get it absolutely right, you immediately see the penalty with the gravel flying. And that's very unusual in Formula One. Usually it's a sort of rumble strip or whatever, or coming out of cops, you don't get it quite right. But here the gravel just says a million words about what the driver's not getting right. But it was interesting when Max Verstappen was finding his way around the track early on this morning, and don't forget it's just a 2-day race weekend, so everything's condensed, and it's very important that the drivers get on top of things very quickly. When Max Verstappen was pushing a few limits, generally speaking, it would be going into the corner and he'd be running a bit wide. By the time he got to the apex, he'd come out of the throttle and he would feel the car that way. It was all to do with the approach to the corner and how he was going to get the platform perfect. I didn't see much of Lewis, I have to say, but I suspect it was the same, and I suspect it was the same with Valtteri, but we'll talk about Valtteri in a minute. Certainly that was what Max was doing. Carlos Sainz, by contrast, and I'm not picking on him, I'm just saying he's an example of a driver who isn't massively manipulative before he gets to the apex. He's all about the ability to hold a car in a slide and get the right rear just running over the curb at just the right millimeter of room. Was making his mistakes and finding his level of grip on exit and running wide and hitting the gravel. And I think that was a very good, and I think it was a similar thing between Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel. Sebastian was, from the start, was kind of lost, because whenever he pushed hard, he'd be running wide, running out of room, then he'd come around the next lap, maybe take it a bit easier with throttle application. But of course, that isn't what Charles was doing. What Charles was doing was manipulating the car long before he was getting to the point of thinking of when he was going to put on the throttle. I had to laugh at one point when, I think it was Sergio Perez, race engineer, said you can give it a bit more throttle. I think it was turn 14. I think he said a bit more throttle. No, it was turn 3. That's right. Give it a bit more early throttle at turn 3 and push harder on the braking into 14. I mean, those sorts of specific instructions should, if the driver's doing his job, be absolutely meaningless. Maybe for Sergio it works to have that sort of, jigsaw puzzle, brake here, put on the power there, turn in over here. But for any driver who's constantly balancing the dynamic weights of the car, as they would be if they were right on top of it, that sort of stuff is just complete nonsense. And I was amazed, actually, that Sergio was taking that, because I've always thought of him as a fairly sort of well-rounded driver who's got lots of curves to his driving and wouldn't respond to little instructions like that. Anyway, that was just a little cameo into the way they were approaching the weekend. And interestingly enough, I don't know whether it's related in any way, but Racing Point were not very good today either. And that was, in fact, they didn't even make it through to Q3. I don't know how long it's been since they were both out in Q2, but it's been a while. And that is a very good car. I really believe it's a good car. It's a very good team. And to have Lance Stroll actually slower than George Russell in a Williams, the team that Stroll left because he wasn't happy with it, and now he's at Racing Point with the whole team built around him. Interesting, isn't it?